In nearly 5,000 years of Japanese history, no foreign force had ever occupied Japanese soil. That was about to change in late 1944 when American planners turned their attention to the small Pacific isle of Iwo Jima. Sitting only 650 miles from Tokyo, this 8-square-mile patch of volcanic ash, rock and sand was unquestionably Japanese, and both sides wanted it for its airfields. The island also served as a vital early warning outpost against American raids on the home islands. Since the summer of 1944, the Japanese mainland had been struck by new long-range Boeing B-29 superfortresses operating from the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, and the U.S. Air Force wanted to use Iwo Jima, roughly halfway between Japan and the Marianas, as a forward base for fighters to escort the B-29s on their long missions over Japan. The island was also planned as a staging area for the eventual Allied invasion of Japan. Imperial headquarters, expecting an invasion, ordered Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander on Iwo Jima, to delay the Americans as long as possible, inflict heavy casualties to weaken their will, and buy time for the home islands to prepare. Kuribayashi, a shrewd and experienced strategist who had learned from earlier Pacific Island campaigns, abandoned the defensive methods that had failed in the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas. His troops would not try to stop the landing at the water's edge or launch suicidal banzai charges. Instead, they would fight a defense in depth, using Iwo Jima's rough terrain and the fighters' skill. They prepared expertly camouflaged positions with overlapping fields of fire. About 21,000 Japanese defenders were then able to fight almost entirely from underground after digging roughly 11 miles of fortified tunnels that connected some 1,500 rooms. Artillery emplacements, bunkers, ammunition dumps, and pillboxes. Tanks under Colonel Baron Takichi Nishi were converted into sealed artillery positions, while the main defensive belt was built in the north. Kuribayashi organized the southern sector around Mount Suribachi as a semi-independent area because the tunnel linking it to the north was never finished. Hundreds of hidden artillery and mortar positions meant virtually every part of the island was under Japanese fire. And a few kamikaze pilots and aircraft were assigned to Kuribayashi for attacks on the enemy fleet. The defenders and their commander fully expected to die. Surrender was forbidden by imperial decree, and each Japanese soldier was urged to kill 10 Americans before being killed. On October 3rd, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, was ordered by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to prepare to capture Iwo Jima early the following year. Iwo, which means Sulphur Island, became the objective of an amphibious assault by a strike force more experienced, better equipped, and more heavily supported than any previous Pacific offensive. The Fifth Fleet under Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance controlled the sea and air around the island, and the landing force of about 74,000 men would outnumber the defenders roughly 3-1. Although American planners admitted Iwo Jima would be difficult to take, Operation Detachment was expected to last no more than a week. In fact, the 3 Marine divisions assigned to the landings were provisionally scheduled to move on to Okinawa 30 days after Iwo was taken. The Joint Chiefs also ordered Nimitz to continue supplying and supporting General Douglas, MacArthur's campaign to liberate Luzon. The Iwo operation was delayed a month. When the Japanese defense of the Philippines proved tougher than expected, and Kuribayashi used the extra time to strengthen his positions. Several of Japan's top fortification engineers, veterans of China and Manchuria, answered his call. The island's soft volcanic rock allowed rapid excavation, so command centers and artillery were dug deeper and the tunnel network expanded. Some underground positions reached 5 levels. Mount Suribachi, rising 556 feet and dominating the island, eventually contained a 7-story interior structure. Except for the chronic shortage of fresh water, Kuribayashi stocked abundant weapons, ammunition, radios, fuel, and rations. American intelligence had underestimated the island's capacity, believing it could support only 13,000 defenders, but Kuribayashi actually had far more men under his command, as the invading Marines would soon learn. For the assault, Spruance chose veterans of earlier island campaigns. Rear Admiral Harry Hill commanded Task Force 53, the attack force, while Vice Admiral Richmond K. Turner led Task Force 51. The Joint Expeditionary Group numbered nearly 500 ships. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions formed the core of V Amphibious Corps under Major General Harry Schmidt, and Marine Lieutenant General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith took charge of the ground forces. The 62-year-old pioneer of amphibious warfare agreed to lead, but protested the limited support arrangements. Beginning December 8th, B-29, superfortresses, B-24 Liberators, and naval guns began pounding Iwo Jima to weaken its defenses. Over about 70 days, an estimated 22,000 shells and 6,400 tons of bombs were dropped on the island. Convinced that even heavy aerial bombardment would not be enough, Smith requested an additional 10 days of naval shelling before the Marines stormed the beaches. Was told the Navy could only give a 3-day preliminary bombardment instead of the longer pounding he'd asked for. Because there weren't enough ships, ammunition replacement was difficult, and surprise had to be preserved. Smith warned that the Marines would run into hell on the beaches, and that would only be the start. Nimitz stood firm, he had no more vessels to send, and accepted that the fighting would be savage and casualties heavy, but he insisted his Marines would take the island. Smith saluted and set about the job. He was even more shocked to learn that the pre-invasion shelling that began on February 16, 1945, never reached the planned intensity. Poor weather-limited visibility and only half-day bombardments were possible on the 1st and 3rd days. Smith, who remembered the hundreds of Marine bodies floating in Tarawa's lagoon in November 1943, worried, but Spruance told him he regretted the Navy's failure to give full support and thought the Leathernecks should be able to handle it. Spruance believed the Navy's inability to overcome Tarawa's defenses had caused earlier losses, but at Iwo the problem was accuracy rather than sheer volume. Kuribayashi's cleverly built and well-camouflaged gun positions survived the pounding. Fewer than 200 of an estimated 9 and 15 fortifications were destroyed, and that didn't count hundreds of smaller but equally deadly strong points held by small enemy detachments. The only place for a mass landing was the Black Cinder, beaches along the island's southeast side. The pork-chop-shaped isle had a wide rocky plateau to the north, and the extinct volcano Mount Suribachi at the southern tip. Those open beaches would be swept by fierce fire from higher ground to the north and south, but they were also the shortest route to the airfields. Schmidt chose to land opposite Mount Suribachi with 2 divisions abreast, the 4th on the right and the 5th on the left, keeping the 3rd as a floating reserve. On February 17th, in a bold daylight reconnaissance, American underwater demolition teams moved toward the beaches in lightly armed landing craft. Defenders dug into slopes on Mount Suribachi opened fire. Despite heavy losses, the frogmen and landing craft completed their mission and found no mines or underwater obstacles. Navy spotters were able to identify many Japanese gun positions on the slopes. At 6:40 a.m. on D-Day, February 19th, the some 450 ships surrounding Iwo began a massive close-range bombardment, firing rounds from 5 to 16-inch guns. Parts of the beaches were literally torn apart, while other shells struck Mount Suribachi. Rocket-armed gunboats hit the Motoyama Plateau, and carrier planes and heavy bombers from the Marianas pounded the beach areas with rockets and bombs. Fire was briefly halted while ships moved into final screening positions for the invasion armada. Then 50 gunboats and 10 destroyers steamed as close as they could and joined the bombardment. The first of 5 assault waves formed about 5,500 yards out, as landing ships lowered their ramps and the creeping barrage reached its height. Each wave, 69 armored LVTs, landing vehicles tracked, carrying about 20 men apiece and able to cross coral if needed, moved forward with their snub-nosed 75mm howitzers firing as they crossed the line of departure. The 4th on the right and the 5th on the left advanced almost unopposed toward the shore. After 30 minutes, the first LVT reached the beach at 8:59 a.m., and by H hour, roughly 8,000 troops were ashore at their assigned beaches. Without a killer tide or coral reef to block them, the Marines briefly hoped for an easy landing. But 2 unexpected natural obstacles soon took their toll: a steep terrace in places up to 15 feet high and soft enough that men sank a foot or more, and only a few LVTs could climb it, and the island's black volcanic ash, which made all the beaches very steep. The surf zone was narrow but violent because deep water lay close to shore. Nearly every armored mortar and rocket vehicle that landed was bogged down in the soft sand. Some LVTs belly-wrapped and stalled before they could unload. Towering waves then struck the stranded craft broadside, filling their sterns with sand and water, and before long the beach resembled a salvage yard. When the landing areas were choked with craft and the terraces clogged with infantry, Suribachi fired signal flares. The defenders then unleashed a rolling barrage of heavy ordnance, artillery, and hidden mortars, while fresh waves of Marines came in every 5 minutes. The first combat patrols pushed about 150 yards, then 300 yards inland. Despite confusion, Marines advanced in small groups rather than as a single mass, and they met fierce close-in fighting from pillboxes, bunkers, and rabbit holes. Every Japanese emplacement became a fight to the death. Many strong points supported one another and often struck Marines from unexpected directions as defenders slipped between holes and reappeared elsewhere. Attackers hurled grenades and poured fire into enemy positions, and as naval fire support closed in, it accurately destroyed some of the nearest firing points. Facing the 4th Division were 10 reinforced concrete blockhouses, 7 covered artillery positions, and roughly 80 pillboxes, and many Marines were badly hurt by hidden mines. Among those killed on the first day was Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, the Pacific Theater's most famous non-commissioned officer. Basilone, who had won the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal and been sent home on a war bond tour, had asked to rejoin the 1st Battalion, 27th Marines, and was killed by machine gun fire on Red Beach 1, later receiving the Navy Cross posthumously. Engineers blew up wrecked boats and stalled LVTs to open lanes for later waves, while beachmasters arrived early to organize the landings. M4 Sherman tanks were rushed ashore after enterprising troops used some of the LVTs to ferry heavy equipment off the beach, despite the carnage. Offloading continued without pause, and communications held up so reinforcements could reach the assault units. By mid-afternoon, the reserve elements, 2 tank battalions, and 4 regimental combat teams had been thrown into the fight. By nightfall, some 30,000 combat troops were ashore, each regiment having landed an artillery battalion. Badly wounded gunners struggled to drag their 105mm and 75mm howitzers across the soft beaches while under fire. By dusk, both division commanders could report that their own artillery was in place and providing close support. Aboard the command ship Laredo 2 miles out, Turner and Schmidt allowed themselves cautious optimism. Despite roughly 2,400 casualties so far, the landing force was in a better position than it had been after the first days at Saipan or Tarawa. That night, both officers feared a mass banzai charge, but Suribachi forbade large-scale suicidal attacks. Instead, small packs of Japanese troops prowled the lines each night, probing for gaps and sneaking raids against Marine outposts. The fighting dragged on and grew costly because the defenders fought with strict discipline and waited to lure Marines into carefully prepared kill zones. The first night on Iwo, Time Life correspondent Robert Sherrod later wrote, was like a nightmare. Illumination shells from destroyers lit the island in a ghastly glare that only helped the Japanese aim at the attackers. Medical personnel were not spared. One aid detachment lost 11 of 26 men, and another lost 16 corpsmen and 2 doctors. By the end of the initial 18 hours, about 2,312 Americans had been killed. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt heard the first reports, he was visibly shaken. On the second morning, the Marines moved forward again after a 50-minute naval barrage, but progress was slower than on day 1. Colonel Harry Liver's 28th Regiment, backed by artillery, half-tracks, and tank destroyers, hammered at the approaches to Mount Suribachi on the far left, yet managed only about 200 yards during the day. After the 4th Division secured airfield number 1 to the north, it swung right to attack the rising ground that formed Suribachi's first main defensive line, and gains there likewise bogged down. The 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, Wired Division, Headquarters. Enemy defenses far stronger than expected. Pillboxes and caves appeared every 10 feet. Although supporting fires were adequate, few of those hardened emplacements were knocked out. Units had to clear positions methodically, taking them one at a time while paying dearly in casualties. Suribachi himself radioed the mountain defenders with stark orders: defend Iwo to the bitter end, destroy enemy men and weapons, use rifle and bayonet to kill every attacker, fire each bullet at its mark, and employ guerrilla tactics to harass the enemy even if only one man remained. That was his last message to Suribachi. Soon the stronghold was cut off when Marines severed the thick communications cable. By D+3, the cable lines were broken, but with naval gunfire and airstrikes, the 28th had pushed almost to the mountain's base. Suribachi had assigned only about 1,160 men to hold the peak because he expected it to be isolated early, yet he had reinforced its base with hundreds of blockhouses, pillboxes, and covered guns, and had carved a complex of caves into the slopes. Every position demanded its own assault using dynamite, mortars, and rockets. Bunkers and cave fortresses had to be taken one by one. M4 Shermans equipped with Mark IV flamethrowers proved especially useful, and Marines even flooded some caves with seawater and petrol to force defenders out. Meanwhile, enemy kamikaze struck at the fleet. The fleet carrier Saratoga and the escort carrier Bismarck C were hit by suicide planes. Despite taking 6 strikes, Saratoga remained afloat, but Bismarck C suffered catastrophic explosions and fire and had to be abandoned, with roughly 200 sailors killed on the morning of D+4. Elements of the 28th finally seized Mount Suribachi on February 23rd at 10:20 a.m., when an advance patrol led by First Lieutenant Harold Schreier climbed the peak and raised a small American flag. A quick photo by Sergeant Lou Lowry captured that moment, but it was Joe Rosenthal's later larger flag raising that became the enduring image. The troops below answered with bells, whistles, foghorns, and wild cheers, yet the capture only marked the start of another bloody month. On seeing the flag, units in the line cheered and resumed their northward push. Schmidt ordered the 3rd Marine Division into the center and went ashore himself to take direct command of the largest body of Marines ever assembled under one leader. Although only a relatively short distance of enemy-held terrain remained, it was obvious every yard would be paid for dearly. The northern plateau had been turned into a fortress over many months. Mortars, artillery, and rockets were plentiful, including massive 320mm spigot mortars firing 700-pound projectiles, larger than anything the Marines had faced before. Intricate blockhouses, cave systems, and pillboxes were everywhere, and the defenders were well-trained and fiercely determined, ready to strap explosives to themselves to strike tanks, to infiltrate Marine lines, or to hold positions to the last. Admiral Turner later said the island was as well defended as any fixed position in the world. The fight for Iwo's northern half was a brutal, close-quarters struggle in which Japanese concealment and prepared positions offset American firepower. Holland Howlin' Mad Smith made repeated trips to the lines to see the carnage for himself. Afterward, he admitted there was no effective way yet to destroy or neutralize defenders in such cramped, fortified terrain, so Marines had to go in and root them out by hand. A 4th Division artillery officer echoed the frustration. There had to be a better method. The savage nature of the campaign was nowhere clearer than in the battle for the 2nd Airfield. Near the island's center, around the 2nd Airfield, the Japanese had built hundreds of pillboxes, foxholes, and hidden gun positions that shrugged off concentrated fire. The ground could not support tanks, so on February 24th, 2 battalions of the 21st Marines rushed forward to cut the enemy lines using grenades and demolition charges. After firing from cover, Japanese defenders would dash into the open to fight with bayonets. The Marines were driven back at first by the fierce counterattack, but they rallied and charged again. Casualties soared on both sides. By nightfall the next day, they had taken the airfield and pushed toward Minami village. To their right loomed Hill 382, grimly nicknamed the Meat Grinder. because of the terrible price paid to capture it. More of the same grinding fighting followed. The Americans had to seize the higher central enemy lines first, and whenever the 4th and 5th Divisions advanced on their flanks, the Japanese struck them hard. The central terrain made it difficult to call in naval gunfire accurately or to bring up tanks and artillery, so infantry units had the slow, deadly job of clearing every position. Forward battalions found a gap and poured through it, and by the 10th day, after the 3rd Division's supporting fires were widened, Marines could look down on the island's 3rd airfield by evening. Minami village lay as a heap of rubble, but Kuribayashi's 2nd defensive belt again blunted their progress, and places like Hill 362 in the west and Hill 382 continued to be stubbornly held. The Marines were worn out, some units reduced to about 30% of their original strength, and the campaign stretched far beyond the 10 days General Schmidt had predicted. Under constant shelling and periodic infiltrations, the 3 divisions tried to regroup and rest when they could. On Sunday, March 5th, the troops watched a damaged B-29 make an emergency landing on Airfield No. 1 after a faulty fuel valve during a raid on Tokyo. Japanese resistance grew ever more desperate. Soldiers hurled themselves beneath tanks and strapped explosives to their bodies. Kuribayashi had already lost most of his armor, many guns, and more than 2/3 of his officers, and as U.S. pressure increased, his communications began to break down. Cut-off officers sometimes launched local counterattacks, which left the greatly reduced Japanese ground forces exposed to American artillery. On the night of March 8 to 9, elements of the 4th Marine Division decisively beat off a major assault, reported to be about 1,000 enemy naval troops, inflicting more than 800 Japanese casualties. A patrol from the 3rd Division reached Iwo's northeastern shore on March 9th and brought back seawater to prove the defenders' line had been split. The American advance was now unstoppable, yet the Japanese showed no sign of surrender. Rising numbers of small banzai charges were the clearest evidence of their desperation. Kuribayashi's messages described the bombardment as so fierce it could hardly be put into words. On March 10th, he reported the Northern Army and Navy holding with some 2,500 men, and by March 15th he wrote that the situation was very serious, with only about 900 men left in the Northern District. The Stars and Stripes were raised, and Iwo was declared occupied on March 14th, but organized resistance had not ended. Many Japanese still lived in the island's maze of caves and tunnels. On March 17th, Kuribayashi urged the remaining officers and men to fight to the end and to devote themselves wholly to the emperor. That same day, American commanders formally proclaimed Iwo secured. The island had been taken, but at a terrible cost. Reports placed total Marine casualties at tens of thousands. Some figures cited 24,127 casualties, including 4,189 dead and 19,990 wounded in under 27 days of fighting. Admiral Nimitz said uncommon valor was a common virtue among the Americans there, and senior leaders publicly praised the Marines' effort. It was not until March 26th, 34 days after the landings, that General Schmidt declared the operation essentially over. After clearing remaining pockets of organized resistance with tanks, demolition teams, rifle fire, and flamethrowers. Only hours earlier, a well-armed band of roughly 150-300 Japanese had slipped through Marine lines and attacked a rear support camp, killing about 200 persons before being overwhelmed. First Lieutenant Harry Martin, leader of the 5th Pioneer Defense, was killed while overrunning a Japanese machine gun post and was later awarded a posthumous Medal of Honor, one of 27 given for Iwo, the most ever awarded for a single Marine Corps battle. Kuribayashi's body was never found, though rumors tied him to that final sortie. Schmidt turned the island over to Army units, the 147th Infantry, and even after the fighting official prisoners continued to be taken, only about 1,083 of the defenders survived. The American public was stunned by the savagery and death on Iwo. There was little time for recrimination. The invasion of Okinawa began 4 days after Iwo fell, and that campaign proved equally brutal. Strategically, the Joint Chiefs had met their goals. Iwo would serve as an emergency landing field and let B-29s carry heavier bomb loads with less reserve fuel. Fighters based on captured islands could escort superfortresses on long raids to Japan. Whether the human cost was worth it remained a painful question, but many airmen who landed on Iwo said they were thankful for the island. In the first 36 days of 1945, roughly 74,000 U.S. assault troops battling about 21,000 determined. Japanese defenders fought a bloody war of attrition over one small Pacific island. About a third of the assault force, some 2,851 Americans, were killed in those weeks, and roughly 6,821 were killed, wounded, or reported missing. Against staggering odds, American bodies finally prevailed over fortified concrete in an assault a historian later called throwing human flesh against reinforced